Okay, so welcome and hello everybody to this event. My name is Edel Doherty and I'm a lecturer in economics at the J.E. Cairnes School of Business and Economics at NUI Galway. It's my absolute honour and privilege to chair this discussion this evening on reconstructing the economy of Ukraine. And before we start, I think I'd like to say on behalf of myself and I'm sure everybody in attendance today, to show our solidarity to the people of Ukraine, our colleagues and friends, you know, in recognition of the huge human cost of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. NUI Galway is an institution for the public good, and I would really encourage all attendees to spend some time looking at the Kyiv School of Economics to really show kind of the optimum of an institution for the public good and the work that they're doing at the moment in support of Ukraine, the economy, and their students there. And on that note, and I know he's currently on the move, hoping to find somewhere for a venue, but I would like to welcome Professor Tymofiy Mylovanov, who's current president of the Kyiv School of Economics and associate professor of economics at the University of Pittsburgh. Professor Mylovanov is a leading author in game theory, contract theory, and institutional design, and his research has been published in the top journals in economics, including the American Economic Review, Econometrica, Review of Economic Studies, to name a few. He's the co-founder of Vox Ukraine, which represents a group of global economists working on policy problems in Ukraine. And in 2016, he was elected to the board of the National Bank of Ukraine, which he served then as deputy chairman of the board until 2019. After that, he served as Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture in Ukraine between 2019 to 2020. And as I mentioned, he's the current president of the Kyiv School of Economics, and it's our absolute honor that he's able to join us for the event and be the main speaker of our event this evening. Also on our panel, I would like to welcome Professor Barry Eichengreen, who is the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Chair and Distinguished Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. I don't think I have time today to go through all Professor Eichengreen's achievements and affiliation, but I'm just going to name several here. So he is a CEPR Research Fellow and a Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also the convener of the Bellagio Group of Academics and Economic Officials. Between 1997 and 1998, he was Senior Policy Advisor at the International Monetary Fund. And I think it's fair to say his research is very wide and broad ranging. He's written work on exchange rates and capital flows, the gold standard and the Great Depression, European economies, Asian integration, the impact of China on the international economic financial system, and IMF policy past, present and future. And Professor Eichengreen has recently published books include In Defense of Public Debt and separately How to Achieve Inclusive Growth, both published by the Oxford University Press. And he's also written on the Irish banking crisis. So it really is wonderful to have Professor Mylovanov and Professor Eichengreen here to discuss the report that they've co-authored on a blueprint for the reconstruction of Ukraine, published as part of the CEPR Rapid Response Economics series. I'd also like to welcome our third speaker, who's distinguished poet and novelist Anne Michaels, who will be formally introduced by my colleague Brendan Connelly later, but I'd just like to say how delighted and grateful that we are that Anne is here and able to speak at our event also. So just before I kind of formally kick off, I just want to sort of give the brief overview of the running order of the event. So Professor Becky Way, who's our Vice President of International at NUI Galway, will say a few words of welcome on behalf of the university. Then I'll invite Professor Mylovanov to speak for maybe 20 minutes or so, followed by Professor Eichengreen. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, or if any of the attendees have any questions for our speakers, pop it into the Q&A box and then I'll ask the question on your behalf. The chat function is currently disabled for this event. And then after this, my colleague Brendan will formally introduce Anne Michaels, who'll be able to give a reading at our event. And then finally, Professor Alma McCarthy, who's our head of the J.E. Cairnes School of Business and Economics, we'll formally close the event. So just to say thank you everybody for coming. We're really delighted to host this event and delighted to have everybody here. And I will ask Professor Becky Way to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Adele, for a wonderful introduction. I also feel very humbled actually to be here to introduce and welcome on behalf of the university. We have all looked on with feelings of horror and helplessness and frustration at the events that have been unfolding in Ukraine and being imposed on Ukraine. And we've been asking ourselves as a global university, what can we do to assist and support? And of course, we're looking at the things we can do in terms of providing places for students and a place of sanctuary and refuge for academics and scholars in as far as we possibly can. But it doesn't feel like enough on its own for any of us. And of course, universities do have this really critical role in discourse dialogue and in questioning perceived truths, and also in our power to collaborate across the globe. So we have an important function that is about challenging what's going on and discussing it and unpacking it. And really importantly, then, we have a role in looking to the future. And thinking about our role as NUI Galway, we have to ask ourselves, what can we contribute to making sure that when Ukraine get through this terrible time, and they will, how do we help ensure that they have a strong future and that they can rebuild and that they have the infrastructure and the human resource to be able to rebuild and come back stronger and even better and to endure long into the future? And I think that academics, universities have a role in that, and that's the role that we really want to embrace, and we're really looking to find our pathway through. And I think that so speaks to the subject of this webinar this evening, which is looking about rebuilding the economy, reconstructing the economy of Ukraine. So it is looking forwards, it's looking beyond the moment now, and it's trying to find a way through this awful situation that we find ourselves in. So before I hand on, I do want to really acknowledge Dr. Brendan Keneally, who's really driven this webinar, and also the Whitaker Institute for hosting it, not to mention the School of Business and Economics, who are very much also the driver of bringing this together and bringing this to people. So once again, I'm delighted to welcome people. I'm delighted that you're able to join and that we can host this discourse. And so now it's my absolute honor to introduce Professor Tymofiy Mylovanov, who is the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, among many other things. And Timothy, everyone is waiting to hear from you, so I'm going to just be quiet and hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. So you'll see I'm with a seatbelt, so I'm in Lviv today. And, the job of an academic in Ukraine has become, as of 2 months ago, a very unusual one in many ways. So we're doing all kinds of needed tasks, from working with the government on sanctions, on design of the sanctions, to the plans for reconstruction of Ukraine, to turning our foundations and fundraising activities that we usually use in normal times for supporting students and supporting education and scholarship. We are now using all these instruments and vehicles for, buying humanitarian relief items and services and products and medical kits and even protective gear like bulletproof vests domestically. And now we're moving to reconstruction in Bucha, trying, normally we would have some kind of fancy panel discussion with Forbes Ukraine about the future of the economy in the spring. Now Forbes Ukraine and us, we're selling an NFT, trying to raise money to rebuild a hospital, small village hospital in Makariv, a village next to Bucha. And, you know, it just becomes a blur. And I remember one point, you know, on February 24th, where I woke up to the very loud banging. And today, you know, I'm talking to you. And so it's been 60 plus days probably now, and it's been just like one day. And then banging, you know, those were missiles, now we know. But at that point, I thought it was just like, you know, my neighbor upstairs was moving furniture or something. So you really get confused, because it's very difficult to comprehend that in the 21st century, you know, me being on faculty in the US at the University of Pittsburgh, visiting Ukraine quite frequently, speaking at panels, you know, in Washington, New York, and London. You know, I wake up in a European capital, in the capital of a European country, because it's been bombarded by missiles, you know, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. I still difficult, you know, the moment I start thinking about it, it's like something went really, really wrong. You know, how did we miss it? Yeah, of course, everyone was talking about it. At least the US intelligence since October 2021, but at some human level, it really should not be happening in the 21st century. I thought, or at least many of my friends and colleagues thought, that it was all left fundamentally in the previous century. And then, you know, people tell me, listen, but isn't it the same in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, everywhere you just like, you have been oblivious to this. And actually, I think I'm guilty, because these things you have to experience. So what the war has taught me, it's really difficult to comprehend certain things unless you experience them, unfortunately. And so, you know, I start with this, don't be like me. Don't wait to experience the things no one should experience. So, you know, we have to, it's not about Russia, Ukraine, Europe. It's about something being really wrong with humanity in some parts of the world. And really takes all nations, the world, and humanity to bring us back from this awful disease that we're seeing now in Russia and in other countries too. So this just should not be happening. We're better as humans, as humankind, we're better than that. And we should find a way that democracy and peace becomes the mainstream, not an exception, you know, in the civilized world. It's just mainstream on this planet. So I think it's a threat. I don't understand how in the 21st century we can be, you know, having Mariupol or Bucha or mass murders or rapes, or, you know, we had a student, an undergrad student from our school. Russians put her into a basement in Vorzel. It's a village close to Bucha, close to Irpin. They kept her there and her family and some other families for 2 weeks without water, not even without food, without water. You know, they had little water with them and they had some food, but they wouldn't let them out. They wouldn't give them water for 2 weeks. She, you know, regular military, okay? All right, so that, you know, and then let me try to kind of maybe focus. I'm sorry I get, you know, sidetracked by this, but let me focus and talk about the reconstruction. One thing is that people believe, or many people think, that there will be some kind of very clear point in time where the war will be over, in the sense that the risks of ballistic missiles falling on cities again will disappear. I don't think that's going to happen. If we look back into the history of the Russian-Ukrainian war, since 2014, the Russian troops or Russian-backed separatists in the east of Ukraine continued to press occasionally forward, but, you know, really attack, and Ukrainian troops would respond. And we have seen the same in Georgia. We have seen the same in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So these even frozen conflicts of wars, they never bring the war risk to zero. So in that sense, when we are talking about reconstruction, we should start thinking about reconstruction now, Because right now we have Bucha, we have Irpin, we have Chernigiv, Sumy, Kyiv, where things, areas have been liberated, and those places need reconstruction of the economy now. So when we talk about the plan, it's not going to be like the World War II, when there will be the official capitulation of Russia in this case, or someone, and then we will be able to reconstruct it. So that's, I think, the point I want to make. So that there are at least 3 phases to reconstruction. One is right now, the other one is immediate after some kind of ceasefire or some kind of normalization, quote unquote, and then the third one, maybe 6 months after that, when we will be in a new post-war reality. But it will be much more continuous than we were used to. Now, what needs to be reconstructed, of course, all the infrastructure, but in terms of the economy, I think the critical part is logistics right now. Because what's happening in Ukraine is that we have harvest, even the previous harvest, and it's rotting. So we can't export. And, I've been talking to businessmen. I've been talking today to the CEO of a major bank and leasing bank. They provide leases of equipment to the agricultural companies and other companies. They're saying, our clients can service the debt. Why? Because they have harvest, they cannot sell it, they can't export. So I think the infrastructure for export through the Western borders is critical. And I also hope that there will be some discussion with Russia, and the international community, together with Ukraine, will reach some deal with Russia that we can export at least something through the ports of Odessa and others. Because otherwise, 2/3 of the exports is blocked. And we have seen that Russia is not very happy about it. Today, they attacked a bridge, actually, in that area. They just destroyed a bridge in a port area in Dniester Liman to cut off infrastructure to the ports. So they're making it difficult. On top of the logistics, I think when we're going to be thinking about recovery, we should focus on energy efficiency, of course, on alternative energy. We want Ukraine to be energy independent from Russia. This is very critical. We are formally independent, more diversified than in the EU in many ways, but we still consume a lot, and in that way we are dependent. And we need to think about the brain drain. I'm really worried that if the intense part of the war continues and goes in the summer and in the fall, then the academic year will start, refugees their kids will go to schools elsewhere, and we'll have a major human capital issue. At this point, about 76 to 78% of refugees would like to come back to Ukraine at the first opportunity. So we would like to, you create this opportunity. So in that sense, reconstruction is needed again now. So we create opportunities for people. Ukraine wants to, be in charge of this reconstruction effort. And I think the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian people have deserved the right to do it. But at the same time, there is a question of trust and credibility and accountability. And so we have a very difficult balancing act here, that we need to make sure that the governance is such that it's very transparent and very credible of any reconstruction effort. And at the same time, Ukraine has leadership and at least ownership on the reconstruction effort. And so what I have been seeing in terms of practical politics or organizational politics, there are about 8 groups I know of. They're all maneuvering to become the leaders inside and outside of Ukraine to lead this reconstruction effort. And so it becomes, kind of your politics. And we need to find a way for more unity among politicians outside of Ukraine and inside Ukraine. So we are focused more on reconstruction rather than on who will be in charge of this reconstruction. I think I will stop here. Just to summarize, I think maybe not really the relevant to the topic of today's talk, but I think there is a major problem with humanity that we somehow missed and we need to address, and it's existential to us, and this should not be happening in this century. We humans are better than that. We should not be killing other humans, and we should find a way for this disease to stop. But it's maybe a bit naive and idealistic. And then the second point is that the reconstruction has to start now, because it will not be a clear end to the war. It will go on for a while, and we need to support economy now. Then I emphasize the politics, organizational politics of the reconstruction, and we urge everyone and call on everyone to try to be less political and more focused on the results. And finally, I suggest that the major focus should be on logistics and on energy. And we, in our report, talk about the leapfrogging opportunities, about sources of funding, and the other ingredients of the plan. But I think one of the most important ingredients are governance and ownership of Ukraine. And I think here's Barry will be able to talk much more, from a much more informed perspective and more expert view on how this and other aspects of the plan could come about. Thank you.
Adele, would you like me to go?
Yes, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I was struck by your and Professor Wei's introduction about the university's public purpose. I think that's something that those of us, I include myself, who work at public universities, ought to hold in our minds, that we have a obligation to try to contribute to public policy debate and to the kind of progress that Tymofiy was emphasizing. So I should preface these brief remarks by emphasizing that I'm not a Ukraine specialist. I sit comfortably 7,000 miles away, but like everyone on this call, I'm horrified by events, and we try to do what we can to contribute modestly to a better future. My expertise is not on Ukraine, but one of the topics I've worked on is the Marshall Plan after World War II. Parallels are not direct, but I think there are some lessons that can be derived from that experience, and some important, and looking at that experience points up also important differences in terms of the situation in Ukraine today that are illuminating. So let me start by the estimates in the report and that are circulating more broadly about Ukraine's financial needs going forward. So the consensus estimate is that Ukraine needs about $5 billion a month of emergency budgetary support starting now, going indefinitely into the future, and that the costs of reconstruction will approach $600 billion. Compare World Bank President David Malpass's statement just prior to the IMF World Bank meetings last week, that the bank was prepared to pledge $1.5 billion. There are other sources of funds that will materialize over time, but I think that is a reminder that we've only begun to think about mobilizing the kind of financial resources that will have to be deployed in a effective reconstruction. And I think we need to start now. In other words, at the moment, there is a lot of attention being paid to the war, to the crisis in Ukraine, to the financial needs of the country, but it's predictable that attention fatigue will set in the age of social media. We will turn our attention to other things. So I think those aid and reconstruction commitments should be put on the table right now while attention is directed at this problem, rather than deferring them into the future. I've also suggested that the United States should contribute disproportionately when we turn to reconstruction, because Europe is on the front lines right now in terms of dealing with the refugee problem, dealing with the logistics problem. Europe borders on Ukraine, and the United States is an ocean or two away. So Europe is going to be bearing much of the initial burden. Hopefully Germany will be bearing more of the burden, not only in terms of hardware, but in terms of curtailing its consumption of Russian gas, which is going to have economic costs for the German and European economies as well, that we in North America will not share. So that's another argument that when we turn to reconstruction, burden sharing arguments suggest that the United States needs to more than pull its weight. Who should administer the funds devoted to reconstruction? So Tymofiy alluded to the complicated politics around that. I would start by saying not the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, in which Russia is a member and is likely to remain a member. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the new bank set up in 1990 to help with the reconstruction of the former Soviet bloc, perhaps, I don't know. So the EBRD did sanction Russia over the war and essentially remove its voting rights. It's a member of the EBRD. I think we need to look more carefully at how well the EBRD has acquitted itself in its earlier efforts to aid reconstruction. Not so well at the beginning, maybe better as time has gone on. My own preference, drawing on Marshall Plan experience, would be to establish a new self-standing body that would be able to avoid bureaucratic holdups and fast-track hiring and disbursements and so forth. That was done with the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan Authority was a separate body. It reported to the US State Department and the US Treasury, but it was not subject to their day-to-day oversight. So some kind of international body that could consult with, cooperate with the IMF and the World Bank, but wouldn't be under their umbrella, I think would be the most efficient way to go. Another point from Marshall Plan experience is that aid for reconstruction can be dispersed and deployed before the war is over. So Tymofiy reminded us that there are different definitions of what it means for this war to be over. So peace was declared in Europe in 1945 for the most part, but Greece continued to experience a civil war for 5+ years subsequently, and Marshall Plan aid was transferred to the legitimate recognized government of Greece, even while that civil war continued to rage. So there is precedent for starting to disperse the aid in sensible ways right now. I, of course, agree, and our report emphasizes that Ukraine needs to cultivate the trust of the donors and be accountable to the donors, but Ukraine needs ownership of the reconstruction program, which means working together with administrators of the donor countries, of the donor agency on the ground in Ukraine. And again, that's what happened with the Marshall Plan, that the recipient governments tabled plans about what exactly they were going to do, and those were basically agreed with the donor agency. I think Western administrators can be embedded in the relevant Ukrainian ministries, and I think the donors are going to require that as a condition for putting $600 billion on the table. But it's ultimately those Ukrainian ministries that are going to have to be in the lead in terms of deploying that money. What should they be spending on? In the short run, I agree, logistics, roads, and bridges. But there is a more difficult problem, which is repairing the housing stock. So Tymofiy alluded to the brain drain problem. People are less likely to come back if they can't be housed adequately. And that's a problem that was a German and European problem after World War II, that they repaired the roads and bridges and railways in the first year. But it took them the better part of a decade to reconstruct the housing stock. And that created headwinds for getting German industry going again. They couldn't house the labor force in the right places. So work from home makes that a little easier, but there are a lot of industries where you've got to have a local labor force still. So I wonder whether we should think more about modular housing and things like that that can be put up quickly. In terms of the energy needs, this is an opportunity for Ukraine to leapfrog, to move quickly toward greening its energy system. And fortunately, the European Union has a recovery fund that's targeted directly at doing that, along with digital stuff. So I think those monies can be deployed to allow Ukraine to move a generation ahead in terms of its energy system. Otherwise, what should Ukraine do? If I understand correctly, the last census of population was in 2001, more than 20 years ago. So where to build the housing stock and so forth could be informed by a proper census. I've been reading about ProZorro. Everybody knows about ProZorro. This is not the guy with the sword, but rather a Ukrainian website for transparency in public procurement. So people have been concerned in Ukraine about, how should we call it, transparency and associated problems for a long time. And the web can be used, I think, to better address those. So the seeds of that are already in place. There are suggestions out there for establishing a commercial court for dealing with the historic problems of the judicial system in Ukraine by establishing a court to adjudicate contracts using English common law, which is kind of the state of the art here, staffed even by foreign judges. So I wonder whether that is a bridge too far in terms of Ukrainian ownership, but it's judicial reform is important. And if not foreign judges, then how to address the problem. So let me stop there.
Thank you both very much for your time and for those insightful remarks. Just to say to attendees now that we have time now for questions and answer section. So if anybody wants to ask a question, and I see one that's coming here straight away. So we have one, so actually two questions. So first one is a question to both professors. To what extent will the 3 Cs initiative be involved in the future reconstruction of Ukraine? Since most of the countries that take part in the initiative prove themselves to be the most devoted allies to Ukraine in the ongoing war and are actively interested in security, would they and the financial infrastructure of the TSI be the main facilitator in Central and Eastern Europe of the possible Ukraine Marshall Plan?
I, for one, have to defer on the grounds that I'm not that familiar with the 3 Cs initiative.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump in then. This indeed the countries which have proven to be strategically aligned with Ukraine. And this is a very interesting question because what at least I have been seeing on a subjective level, it's just going to be my opinion. You know, I've been seeing that what Ukraine has done, it's a little bit a background remark, but what I have seen the government has done, what President Zelensky has done before the war, he has changed the way he allocates his attention and effort in terms of countries close to Ukraine. Poroshenko, the previous president, has mostly been working with Germany and France for resolution of the war in Donbass. While Zelensky started moving towards the Baltic Seas, Poland, Turkey and generally the countries around Black and Baltic Sea, and also Georgia and Azerbaijan. And that has changed the dynamics and it gave much more agency to Ukraine. That's again my very subjective opinion, but it is perceived domestically as a smart strategic move in terms of changing the priorities. In that sense, the 3C initiative might play the role. The countries definitely will be involved. In which specific forms, that is difficult for me to say, because what I have been seeing now is a lot of bilateral, trilateral initiatives done with Ukraine by multiple combinations, subsets of countries.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question we have is, what is the appropriate balancing between debt financing and grants and funding the reconstruction? And is debt financing appropriate at all?
My view would be debt financing is not appropriate under the circumstances. Ukraine has existing debt that is going to have to be renegotiated with the creditors, and that's a difficult and time-consuming process. I'm reminded that the Marshall Plan was 90% grants and 10% debt.
Okay, great. Then we just have a question, I think, around the kind of leapfrogging, I think, around maybe energy. And then the question is, since both professors mentioned the degrees of leapfrogging, could they elaborate on what they see this potential, where they see this potential most clearly?
So maybe in industry, in general, in manufacturing, so we have metallurgy, and just to be specific, we have, and right now, most of the sources, deposits of the required for, of ore, of iron ore, in the areas under control of Ukraine. So they are likely to stay there. This is just one example. So with the last years or decades, we only have one green metallurgical plant. It was in Dnipro. The remaining are like Azovstal, which is in the news, but also Illicha or in Kryvyi Rih, the major plant. They are all really outdated. They are ecologically problematic. They consume a lot of energy, so they're very energy inefficient. And they're just there. Of course, no one is going to demolish them. But since they are being demolished now, this would be one very natural example where we will build greener metallurgy. This is just one example. Another example would be, we had really politically difficult structural reform with healthcare, public healthcare system, because we have the legacy system of the Soviet Union legacy system of a lot of really large buildings in every village, and it was very, very difficult to change it into more efficient, modern, smaller, but higher professional, more focused, more centralized, more specialized hospitals. And now in many areas, this is just, we can build from scratch. And the third example I'll give will be in AI, in high tech area. We are currently having a lot of IT developers working, for example, on military AI and face recognition applications, which allow to identify special ops and saboteur groups. And they have been successful. There's not much about it in the public sphere on the news, but we have been, the moment we think a little bit about it, Russia has not been very successful in the cyber warfare. And the cyber warfare theater is there, has not been able to disrupt the banking system, has not been able to disrupt the communication system, It has not been able to disorient drones or high precision weapons in Ukraine, and so on. So there are a lot of technological development that maybe not leapfrogging, but you could imagine that many of them will have commercial applications and will be widely accepted and adopted by the Ukrainian government, by businesses, and by industry more general, also outside of Ukraine. And my fourth and final application is that we're sitting, at least in that part of the world, many of us are sitting on legacy platforms from the Soviet Union, from Russia, from kind of, it's historically, originally there were some IT programs, but eventually these are all Russian, like all our accounting or payment systems often are sitting, not only in our country, in Belarus, and even in Baltics, by the way, even in Poland, many of applications are Russian developed applications. So they're vulnerable now. And this war forces us to abandon these platforms and switch away from those platforms. So this, I went in my answer beyond leapfrogging, but on the existing industry, clearly, outdated industry, we can leapfrog, but there are also applications which are developing and changes in platforms, so coordination problems which are being solved, which will have positive externalities for decades to come.
Okay, great. And I see a question here, and I think it's mentioned a lot in the report as well about the question is there willingness for Ukraine to join the EU? And I think when I read the report, it sort of was a kind of a large part in terms of sort of the long-term economic development of Ukraine. So I guess in terms, maybe the question is there a willingness to join the EU? But then maybe in terms of what timeline, if it's even possible to think of a timeline of when that might be possible to do so.
Well, history suggests that it, go ahead, Timothy.
No. You go ahead and I'll answer on the willingness and a couple of unexpected remarks, but on the broader, I think you're better equipped to answer what the broader perspective is.
Well, if you give me the microphone, I'm going to start with 3 quick hits on the leapfrogging point. Number one, an obvious one is railway gauge, right? That Ukraine still has, with maybe one exception, Russian railway gauge, which is wider than the EU and causes you to have to do all kinds of difficult adjustments at the border in order to run trains. So reconstructing the railways on Western European lines is an obvious point. Second one, I think, is housing, that energy efficiency also is strongly affected by how you construct the housing stock. So this is an opportunity to do that in an energy efficient way and rethink urban planning in ways that are more efficient, not only for getting refugees back in the country, but more broadly for the 21st century. On the EU, history suggests that it is a lengthy, time-consuming process. It takes a decade. It took Ireland a decade, right, to complete its accession negotiations, if I recall. So these are extraordinary circumstances. Maybe we should take advantage of the period of extraordinary politics, which is what these kind of episodes are referred to try to expedite that process and get it done in a period of 2 or 3 years. If Ukraine can quickly align its institutional arrangements with those of the EU, maybe it can be done faster than it's been done historically.
Right. So I'll just add, I just talked to a number of ministers over the last week or so, and they're filling out the second part of the EU application questionnaire. So the first part is 280 pages of questions. It's really like, I have it in front of me, not right now, but in my computer here. It just, it's really 280 pages of question after question after question. It's not a discussion. It's just like, what about that? And what about this? And, these are all the standards that have to be aligned, It's just the amount of work, apart from the technical work that needs to be done, is overwhelming. So it's going to be a tedious process. We have this Ukraine association agreement with the EU, DTFCA, which was also hundreds of pages, and almost no one has read it fully. We have a couple of people in Ukraine who are considered to be experts on the EU, and they have read this, and it's like Encyclopedia Britannica before that. So just to get a sense of how much work needs to be done. So I would hope that it can be done faster, overcoming the technical and political reasons. But I also think I'm really looking forward to it, because it's going to open up some opportunities in politics. We will have opportunities in Ukraine for professional civil servants and for professional politicians to be now not just a part of Ukrainian politics, but also become a part of the European politics. So we'll have to elect MPs, we'll have to elect members of different agencies, representatives. And so that gives a lot of career paths for young and very well-educated and trained and patriotic and, just good humans, in Ukraine. And currently, part of our politics until recently has been dominated by oligarchs. And so, many of people like me really don't want, I don't want to be an MP. It's really simply too toxic. Yet I think something is changing right now. I'm amazed how quickly all Ukrainian oligarchs have lost power. It's like just over these 2 months, oligarchs don't have a say anymore. And unfortunately, under the really bad circumstances, but this is another of those examples of silver linings there. We kind of don't have capture anymore. And I hope it will stay that way. And also hope the EU will provide us an anchor, a framework for it's an example of political leapfrogging. Basically, if it were a normal process, we would have to have another decade or two to kind of get rid of oligarchs, or at least of their influence. Now they are all in line. We just need to keep it that way. And so I think here the EU standards, the EU institutions will help, and it would be a pity, a tragedy to waste this opportunity politically.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's kind of interesting. I think when we always think of the EU, we do think a lot of regulations and technicalities. I think we're sort of all used to that a little bit. But I guess just moving on, because I'm just conscious of time and there's a lot of questions, and I may not go through all questions, but we have a question here about why not set up a multilateral development bank dedicated to funding reconstruction and infrastructure investment in Ukraine, possibly including through equity investment and political risk guarantees to private projects to maximize funding available after the war.
Do we want to set up another institution like the World Bank and like the EBRD, but targeted at Ukraine's needs? I think a self-standing, a lean and mean agency can work together with those existing institutions.
Okay, great. And I have a question here, and it's directed to Professor Eichengreen. So will the Fed interest rate increases impact American willingness to finance the bulk of the Ukrainian Marshall Plan?
Well, I think anything that dents economic growth in the United States and globally will make choices more difficult. So there are at the moment, I'm more worried about the slowdown in China than I am about what the Fed is doing. But that's another reason to put commitments on the table now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a question then about the oligarch influence in politics, but I think we've already addressed that previously. I suppose then, there's a few kind of questions around, maybe the risk of reconstruction now, given that the war is ongoing, given that Russia may come back and attack, other aspects of, you know, if we're repairing bridges and roads, and I mean, like, I suppose that's the thing we can't predict, but I mean, is there any thoughts on that, if there are risks of reconstructing now?
Yeah, okay, so I think there are risks. Furthermore, I think the Russian military will try to make it, or the Russian politicians will try to make a point to discourage a reconstruction. So when someone will start being built, they will attack it, or likely to attack it, to discourage reconstruction from happening now, because it's against their strategic objective. If the economy of Ukraine is going to be doing well, that means it will be more difficult for them to achieve their objectives in the war theater. So, however, we have seen that before then, when they have been trying to, once they've seen that Ukraine is resupplying, they start targeting fuel depots. So Ukraine adjusted its behavior in some ways. Recently, they started targeting railroads. So they've been trying to do that. And this is a question of smart design. Two aspects. We have to be ready that the first projects will be attacked. They will be bombarded, and we might want even to be very conscious about this and provoking, you know, sort of, not provoke, that's the wrong word, but kind of design it in the way that some of these, you know, projects are false projects. So the damage is not serious. But we should focus on smaller projects, widespread projects, you know, so that each of them is not worth the, you know, it doesn't present a valuable target, and all of them together really make a difference. So I think we will be talking about a coordinated, decentralized recovery.
Yeah, I'm just I'm conscious of time. And I suppose maybe I'll just ask one more question, if that's okay, from the chat. There has been questions about whether we can put the report, and I think it'll be no problem to email that after to attendees. And then, so maybe the final question, and I suppose it's all maybe for us to think about, is that in previous crises, we've seen financial commitments not materialize. You know, how can we ensure, if we can ensure that this doesn't happen again, or at the very least that most of the commitments materialize? And I think it's kind of a hard question to answer towards the end of the discussion.
Gary, you wanna go first, or you want
So
to try to?
I wish there was an easy answer to that question, but again, I've emphasized the importance of beginning to materialize those commitments now. I think it should be recognized that reconstruction in Ukraine will be a multi-year process, so the donors can try to describe and in that way commit to a schedule of contributions over time. But I think it's unavoidable that you know, successive budgetary rounds will occur in each country that is contributing annually or quarterly or whatever it is, and that there is no guarantee other than everybody believing that their partners are doing their part.
I completely agree with that, and also this is a difficult question, and it would be great to have commitments earlier. And I can just share the experience or impressions from the fundraising that we have been doing over the last 2 months. So for academic and humanitarian purposes, and I pitch, you know, I use this opportunity to pitch it, go to my Twitter and please support the Kyiv School of Economics financially too, if you can. Or we do all kinds of activities supporting scholars to buying medical kits, to whatever. But, you know, looking at the structure, in the first, let's say 3 to 4 weeks, everyone was emotional and everyone was willing to give funds. And, you know, once we got those commitments were on, you know, on the table, and they are there. And after that, kind of fatigue kicked in. And so what I think we are now in this stage before the fatigue on reconstruction, the commitments we'll get right now, this will be the money, but then eventually fatigue will kick in. However, there is a way to manage the fatigue. You need to demonstrate the resilience, you need to demonstrate the results. And we have been able to continue to raise money by addressing the emerging needs or perceptions of the donors. So I think Ukraine will have really a difficult challenge, and it will have to address it to continue to keep the donors engaged in a meaningful way. And that should be combined with the process of candidacy for the EU. So it has to be somehow designed that these two things happen together, and there's some dynamics. Russia will continue to be a threat. In that sense, I think there will continue to be motivation for to support the Ukrainian economy, so that Ukraine can provide, we don't have a repetition, or we don't have another episode of Russia invading the country the moment they will feel that it is weak economically or militarily. What I really worry about is that imagine Russia implodes during this process of reconstruction, and then it also will need major support financially from the world if there is a regime change. So that no one has been thinking about this, and I don't know how to address that. That can create all kinds of issues domestically in Russia and internationally. I think that is probably not an immediate possibility, but that's something to be, if the reconstruction is a long multi-year project, at some point Putin will simply die, even if nothing happens politically. And then there will be a battle for power in Russia, and it might go in a major crisis and destabilize the economy and politically, domestically, and then therefore politically the area. There'll be Kadyrov 1, Kadyrov 2, Kadyrov 3, all vying for power, and there'll be all kinds of issues, and the world will have to address that too, that point.
Okay, great. I mean, I think we really appreciate you obviously both taking the time to answer these questions. And, I think there's sometimes questions and the answers are just so difficult. But we really do appreciate your time. And I suppose what I'd like to do, because I'm going to hand over the chair now to my colleague Brendan Kennelly, is just to thank you both for taking the time. And there was a question on the chat about where to donate. And I think the Kyiv School of Economics and all the work that they're doing, as I said, to support Ukraine and the fundraising efforts will be an excellent place to start. And thank you both. And thank you both, Professor Mylovanov. We really appreciate your time. And, I know you're doing a lot of these. I've seen a few different things that you've done, and you really are, I think, an inspiration to us here, as a member of the academic community, and for all your work you're doing. And I think you really shine the best light on what it is to be an academic. And I think how people react in crises really is a measure of your character. So I really thank you, and we really appreciate the time too from Professor Barry Eichengreen to take the time to discuss this with us. And certainly we will keep thinking about Ukraine and think of, as a university for the public good, what we can do obviously to support you. So thank you both very much. And I'd like to just hand over to my colleague, Brendan Kennelly now.
To close the event, and I want to just ask my colleague, Professor Alma McCarthy, the head of the Cairnes School of Business and Economics, to close the event. And thank you all very much for participating. Alma.
Thanks very much, Brendan. It's fantastic to have had the event this evening. So I just have a couple of things to say, just to wrap up. I don't know if you want to, if Courtney wants to change maybe who's pinned there, or am I up? I don't know. I'm up. Okay, great. So I just want to, and I'll be brief because we're coming after a long day and a very, really good event with lots of great content. I just want to offer a very warm welcome to each of our international speakers, if they're ever able to come to Ireland and to Galway to visit us here in the city and here in the business school. We'd love to have you. It's great to have these events online, but of course we don't get to meet people, so you would be most welcome. Timothy and Barry and Anne, if you're ever in this part of the world, to come and see us and talk to us. I think there's, it's been a fantastic event, and it's been really interesting. I'm not an economist. My own background is in human resource management, so it's interesting to hear the economics input, and of course then Anne's input in terms of the human side and taking lessons from literature. I suppose just a couple of things that have struck me. Timothy starts there by saying, by apologizing for having to move and that. And I mean, I think we are all in awe at the fact of how everyone there is able to continue in the way and shape that they are in the most difficult of circumstances. And I want to thank him very sincerely for being able to participate and for the excellent insight this evening. Barry mentioned attention fatigue, and I think that struck me. With a lot of these catastrophes and that, we're very tuned in early on, and I just hope that the attention and the focus and how people are feeling about the current situation, that it doesn't wane. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that it doesn't, and that we continue our focus for the Ukrainian people. And I think it was very interesting to listen to about the, how soon we need to actually engage in reconstruction, not waiting. And your focus there on the, sorry, you used the word horror a few times. And I think all of us on this call, that's what we have felt as we've looked at images of children and young women and men being, their lives turned upside down and inside out, in what is just insanity in terms of understanding why and how this could happen, as we say, in 2022. And also, I think it's great to kind of focus on the hope, and if we don't have hope, we have nothing. So it's great to hear you talk about the hope that can come out of such darkness. So I just want to kind of maybe reiterate our support and solidarity here on behalf of J.E. Cairnes School of Business and Economics and the university. And we will do what we can to help. I think a lot of us feel that a sense of helplessness in terms of how we can impact, but a lot of us are doing different things, and we're doing the best that we can. I think Ireland is very empathetic to the situation that's there at present. So I just want to kind of reiterate our support and solidarity. I want to thank everyone who has attended this evening. We had a lot of interest in this event. And also we'll be making the recording available to those who registered. And of course, last but certainly not least, is to thank our speakers and our event organisers. So sincere thanks to Professor Tymofiy Mylovanov, and apologies for the pronunciation, Professor Barry Eichengreen and Anne Michaelis for your time. It's very clear that you've put a lot of thought and prep into the session and given your time so generously this evening. I want to thank my NUI Galway colleagues who participated, the Vice President for Internationalisation, Professor Becky Way, our Chair, Dr. Adele Doherty, and Courtney and Angela at the Whitaker Institute, which is a fantastic support for running our research and events like this here in the school and in the college. And I'll finish up by thanking Brendan. So Brendan, raised his hand. We had a strategy offsite event a couple of weeks ago for the school. And Brendan raised his hand and spoke about what we could do and what we should be doing for the Ukrainian people at this time. And subsequent to that, Brendan sort of came up with this idea and has organized this event. And it's really has been excellent. And I think the quality of our speakers and the international reach that we have here and the number of attendees that we had shows how valuable it has been. So I want to really thank Brendan for organising it and for bringing us all together. And hopefully this is the start rather than the end of some of these discussions, and that we'll be perhaps having more, and where we can add value, we will try to do so in meaningful ways. So that's it from me. And I think that's it to end the session. So on behalf of everyone here at NUI Galway and the School of Business and Economics and our speakers, thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you soon.